July 1944, Normandy, the Cotentin Peninsula. A German sniper is lying behind a hedgerow somewhere west of St. Lo. He has been there since before dawn. His Carabiner 98K rifle, fitted with a ZF-41 telescopic sight, rests on a folded piece of canvas to keep the dust out of the action. The hedgerow at his back is 6 ft of compacted earth, ancient roots, blackthorn and bramble. From his position, the bocage looks like a perfect defensive system. It is. He has been told that the Americans cannot crack it, and for 6 weeks the American advance has been confirming it. Yards a day, sometimes feet, sometimes nothing at all. He's been trained in the doctrine every German marksman learns. Fire one shot, wait, confirm the kill, then move, always move. Never fire from the same position twice. A sniper who stays in place is a sniper who dies. The German sniper manual of 1944 is explicit. The single most important rule of survival is movement after firing. At some point in the morning, an American soldier becomes visible at the edge of the next field. A radio man by the look of him, the long whip antenna, the way he leans forward as he speaks into the handset. The sniper takes his time. The wind is almost nothing. The range is 200 meter. He breathes out and he fires once. The radio man drops. Now, by every rule his instructors taught him, he should be moving. He's done his work. Time to crawl back through the bocage, slip into the field behind, find a new position 200 meters to the left. The Americans will respond. They always respond. But by the time their response arrives, he will be gone. Except this time, something is wrong. He's not finished folding the canvas before he hears it. Not the rifle shot that always follows. Not the angry chatter of an American machine gun firing blind into the hedgerow. Something else. Something heavier. Something dropping out of the sky. He has perhaps 4 seconds before the first 60mm mortar shell explodes inside the hedgerow. With him. How did they know? He's not fired a second shot. He's not exposed himself for a second time. By the doctrine he learned, he should still be invisible. The Americans should still be searching empty ground, taking minutes to organize a response, giving him all the time in the world to disappear. What he does not know, what almost no German sniper on the Western Front fully understood until the war ended, is that the United States Army had built something his instructors had never seen. Not a new weapon, not a new scope, not a piece of espionage trickery. A system, a way of thinking about firepower that turned every American rifle squad into the front end of a machine the Germans could not match and could not copy. This story is about that machine, about why German prisoners taken in Normandy, the Hurtgen, and the Bulge kept returning to the same complaint in their interrogation transcripts, about why captured sniper logbooks from the Western Front grew thinner as the campaign went on, about a question that haunted survivors of the German sniper schools for decades after the war ended. How did the Americans locate them so quickly when by every rule of their craft, they should have been untouchable? The answer is not the one the Germans were looking for, and that, more than anything else, is why they could not solve it. To understand what happened in that Normandy hedgerow, we have to go back 6 years, and we have to meet the most carefully prepared small arms specialist any army has ever produced. Not the most famous, not the most numerous, the most carefully prepared in proportion to the number of men carrying the rifle. The German sniper of 1944 was the end product of a doctrine the German army had been refining since the First World War. In the trenches of Flanders and the Argonne, German marksmen using Mauser rifles with telescopic sights had killed Allied soldiers in numbers far out of proportion to their own. When the war ended in 1918, most armies forgot about snipers. The British broke up their schools. The Americans, who had never built a serious sniper program in the first place, simply stopped thinking about it. The Germans did not. Through the 1920s and 1930s, under a treaty that limited their army to 100,000 men, the Reichswehr quietly kept the sniper tradition alive. When Hitler began rebuilding the Wehrmacht in 1935, the institutional memory was still there. By 1942, there was a formal sniper school at Sachsen, south of Berlin. By 1944, there were several schools across the Reich. The instructors were not parade ground academics. They were combat veterans, men who had survived multiple campaigns on the Eastern Front, men who could tell you from personal experience exactly how many seconds an enemy sniper had to move before the answering shot would find him. Their primary weapon was deceptively simple. The Karabiner 98K, the standard German service rifle, modified with a telescopic sight mount. The most widely issued sight on the Western Front 1944 was the ZF-41, a 1.5 power scout-style scope about the size of a small flashlight. The schools themselves did not love the ZF-41. Most sniper instructors considered it too low in magnification for true sniping work, more useful as a sharpshooter's aid than a sniper's optic. But more than 100,000 of them were produced, and they were everywhere. A more effective system was the 4-power ZF-4 mounted either on the K98K or on the new G43 semi-automatic rifle. In the hands of a trained marksman, either combination could put rounds inside a small circle at 400 meters all day. At 200 meters, where most fighting in Normandy took place, the German sniper was effectively choosing which American he wanted to kill. The weapon was the smallest part of the system. The bigger part was the training. A German sniper candidate moved through weeks of intensive instruction covering ballistics, weather correction, hide construction, movement under observation, and the meticulous discipline of firing one shot and disappearing. Candidates learned what was sometimes called the hare's leap, the sudden zigzag run when artillery began to bracket a position. They learned to identify enemy infantry weapons by the sound they made when fired, so the correct evasion could be chosen on instinct. The graduation requirements included a final field exercise. The candidate had to stalk to within firing range of an instructor team, take a simulated shot, and exfiltrate without being detected. Those who failed the exfiltration phase were failed overall, even if their marksmanship had been perfect. The doctrine rested on one assumption that in every previous war the Germans had fought had been correct. After sniper fires, the enemy needs time to determine where the shot came from. He needs to see the muzzle flash, hear the report, piece together evidence from witnesses, then organize a response. All of that takes time. Even an efficient Soviet rifle company required tens of seconds, often minutes, to begin returning effective fire on a sniper position. By the time that fire arrived, the German sniper was already crawling away through dead ground. In the East, against the Red Army, through 3 years of brutal combat, this had worked. It had worked spectacularly. Instructors told their students, with reasonable evidence behind the claim, that a sniper who followed the doctrine had a higher survival rate than any other frontline soldier in the army. They were right. As a statement about the war, the Germans had been fighting until June of 1944. Then the Americans came ashore. The first weeks of fighting in Normandy were a horror show for the American infantry. The bocage was the kind of terrain that had been built, almost as if by design, for defensive infantry combat. Every field was bordered by a hedgerow. Every hedgerow was a fortress. Every fortress could conceal a machine gun, a mortar team, an anti-tank gun, and a sniper. American casualty rates in those first weeks were the worst the Army had experienced in the war. Some companies lost half their men in a single day's advance of less than 1,000 yards. A significant share of those losses came from snipers. Officers, identified by their map cases, their gestures, their position at the front of an advancing column. Radio men, identified by their antennas. Medics who, despite the Red Cross brassard, were targeted as eagerly as anyone else because killing a medic broke the morale of an entire squad. Forward observers, identified by their binoculars and their equipment. Anyone, in short, whose death would create disproportionate damage to the American chain of command. By mid-July, after weeks of taking these losses, the American command was facing a real crisis. Casualty reports going up to General Bradley's headquarters had one phrase appearing in the analysis sections more than any other. Sniper fire, sniper fire, sniper fire. The bocage was eating the infantry, and a substantial part of the bocage's appetite was being supplied by men who fired one shot and disappeared. The Americans needed an answer. What they found was not the answer the Germans expected, and not the answer most of the post-war histories describe. It was something stranger, something that grew out of an organizational habit the Americans had developed for an entirely different purpose, a habit so deeply embedded in how the American infantry fought that the men using it did not think of it as a counter-sniper technique at all. It was just how they did their work. And the moment that habit was turned on the German sniper, the rules of his profession changed in a way no one had warned him about. In July of 1944, the United States Army had its own snipers. They were not famous, they were not numerous, and in the early weeks of Normandy, they were not particularly effective against the Germans. The standard American sniper rifle was the M1-3A4, a scoped variant of the Springfield bolt-action rifle that had been the Army's main weapon during the First World War. The A4 carried a Weaver 330C commercial telescopic sight, given the military designation M73B1 mounted on Redfield Jr. rings. The scope offered just 2.5 power magnification with a simple crosshair reticle. It was not hardened for military service. The rifles themselves had no special accuracy work done to them. No bedding, no improved trigger. Production cost was roughly $64 apiece. About 28,000 were made, all by Remington Arms, with production ending in the summer of 1944. The Americans had entered the war with neither sniper rifles nor a sniper training program. As troops began to see combat, requests came back to the War Department that both were urgently needed. The M1-3A4 was rushed into production to fill the gap. A counter-sniper course at the Fort Benning Infantry School was working through its early curriculum during 1943 and 1944, but the course was short, the graduates were few, and the doctrine being taught was still being worked out. Some divisions sent men through it, many did not. The Marines fighting in the Pacific had a more developed sniper culture, drawing on the long-range shooting traditions of Camp Perry and the national match competitions. But the Pacific was a different war, and the Marines were not in the bocage. So when an American infantry company in Normandy ran into a German sniper, the company's response was rarely a single American sniper hunting back. The trained American counter-sniper, if there was one at all, was usually somewhere else, attached to a different unit, asleep, taking a meal, or already dead. The realistic response options for the company were less elegant. Spray the suspected hedgerow with machine gun fire, move riflemen forward to fix the position, wait for the sniper to fire again, and try to triangulate by sound and bearing. None of these options worked very well against a competent German sniper who followed his doctrine. The machine gun was guessing, the riflemen advancing forward took further casualties. The waiting failed because the German was not staying long enough to be triangulated. There was something else making the situation worse. Post-war studies established that as much as 75% of all American casualties during the Normandy campaign were caused by mortar fire, not by direct small arms fire. The British and Canadian numbers were similar, around 70%. The Germans had become expert at using their mortars in concert with their snipers and machine gunners. The German Granatwerfer 34, the 80mm mortar, could throw a nearly 8 lb shell out to about $300 d. Once an American assault was stalled or pinned, pre-sighted indirect fire dropped on the Americans like rain. Snipers fixed the company in place. Mortars killed it. In late June and into July, American infantry officers in Normandy began to discover something. The traditional duel between American infantry and German sniper was a duel the Americans were going to lose more often than they won. They needed something different. They needed a way to turn the moment after the German sniper fired into a kill zone the German could not survive. And here is where the story turns. Because the Americans, almost without thinking about it, already had the basic tool for the job. They had not designed it for sniper hunting. They had designed it for something else entirely. But it was sitting in every infantry battalion in the Army. And once American troops began to use it for counter-sniper work, the entire dynamic of the war against the German sharpshooter shifted. The tool was not a rifle. It was not a scope. It was a system of communication and fire control that the German Army did not possess, had not built, and could not have replicated in the time it had left. The system had a dull, bureaucratic name, the Fire Direction Center, the FDC. It had been developed before the war by a handful of obscure officers at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Carlos Brewer, the school's director of gunnery in the late 1920s, and the instructors who worked under him, had abandoned the older practice of massing fire by described terrain features and replaced it with something new, a firing chart. Battery positions located by survey, targets designated by reference to a single base point on the chart using a coordinate system every American artillery unit in the Army would share. They built it on minimal budget through the Depression years. Most of the Army considered the work eccentric and the requirements impractical. Brewer's team built it anyway. By 1944, the FDC concept had become the most lethal artillery network in the world. American battalions could call for a massed fire mission and have shells in the air within minutes. The Germans, whose own artillery was based on a more decentralized doctrine, could not match the speed. What makes this story interesting, though, is not the artillery. It is what the FDC system did to the smaller weapons. To the mortars, the 60mm mortar carried by each rifle company, the 81mm mortar carried by the heavy weapons company, the 4.2-inch mortar attached at regimental level through the chemical mortar battalions. These were not artillery in the formal sense. They were infantry weapons designed to be moved with foot soldiers and placed wherever they were needed. The American sergeants and forward observers who learned to do this work in the bocage did not fight for glory. They fought because someone had to walk the field and call the fire that kept the next hedgerow from killing the next squad. To understand what the American forward observer represented, you have to understand what he was not. He was not a sniper. He was not, in most cases, even a designated marksman. He was an artilleryman attached to an infantry unit, riding with it, walking with it, sharing its rations and its foxholes and its risks. He was usually a lieutenant or sergeant in the artillery branch, and he carried two pieces of equipment that defined his role: a pair of binoculars and a radio. The radio was the more important of the two. The standard American forward observer in Normandy carried the SCR-300, a backpack radio designed by Daniel Noble and Henryk Magnuski and others at the Galvin Manufacturing Company, which would later become Motorola. The first radio in history to be called a walkie-talkie. The SCR-300 weighed 38 lb and operated in the 40 to 48 MHz frequency range, using frequency modulation rather than amplitude modulation to defeat the static and interference that had plagued earlier sets. Through it, the observer could speak directly to a fire direction center several miles to the rear. He spoke to the FDC using a procedure that had been worked out at Fort Sill in the 1930s. He identified his observation point using the universal map grid every American artillery unit on the continent had been issued. He described the target using the same grid. He called for a specific type of fire. He requested a specific number of rounds, and he waited. In the FDC, gunnery officers using pre-computed firing tables also developed at Fort Sill. In the 1930s, converted his coordinates into an elevation and an azimuth for every gun in range of the target. The guns were laid, the crews were alerted, and on a single voice command from the FDC, every tube fired at a calculated moment so that every shell arrived at the target at the same second. This was the time on target mission, the TOT. It was the technique that had taught German artillery batteries in Italy to fear the very sound of an American radio transmission. It was, by 1944, the deadliest single innovation in 20th century artillery, and it cost almost nothing to develop because it was not a piece of hardware. It was a way of organizing what the Americans already had. Now apply that procedure to the mortars. The same Fort Sill protocols, the same coordinate grids, the same forward observer drills also govern the smaller tubes attached to the infantry. The 60mm M2 mortar in a rifle company, the 81mm MEPR N1 mortar in a heavy weapons company, the 4.2 in mortar of the chemical battalion, all of them were wired into the same fire direction network. All of them could respond to a forward observer's call. The difference between calling for the 60mm mortar and calling for divisional artillery was the response time. Artillery, with its longer chain of command and larger guns, took 2 to 4 minutes from voice request to shells in the air. The company's 60mm mortar, with its crew sitting beside the tube 200mm mortar behind the front line, could respond in under 30 seconds. In some documented cases, under 15. The M2 mortar's primary high explosive round, the M49A2, weighed about 3 lb and had a bursting radius of roughly 17 d. Think about what that meant for a German sniper. He fires his shot. He starts to move. Within about 10 seconds, an American forward observer or a squad leader with a radio has identified the general bearing of the shot. He's called the company mortar section. The call is brief. Grid reference, sniper, fire for effect. Within another 10 seconds, the mortar crew, who have been waiting their tube for exactly this kind of call, have set the elevation and azimuth using the firing table values they have been calling out all morning. Within another 5 seconds, the first round is in the tube. Within another 5 seconds, the round detonates inside the hedgerow with the sniper. Total elapsed time from the sniper's shot to the first impact, under a minute. In some cases, under 30 seconds. The sniper, working from a doctrine that assumed a 2 to 4 minute response window, has not yet completed his exfiltration. He has crawled perhaps 15 meter. The mortar is not aiming at where he is right now. The mortar is aiming at a box of ground roughly 50 meters on a side. The box is large enough that it does not matter whether the sniper has moved 15 meters or 20. He is still inside it. The first round detonates. The crew, following standard procedure, fires a second round, then a third, then a fourth, walking the impacts across the box. Within 90 seconds of the sniper's original shot, the entire 50 square bocage is being hit at a rate of roughly 1 explosion every 2 seconds. Every explosion sending fragments through the brush at chest height in every direction. And here is the part the German manuals did not prepare anyone for. The Americans have not located the sniper. They never located him. They cannot see him. They do not know exactly where he was when he fired. They do not know where he is now. They only know the bearing from which the shot came and the approximate distance. And that is enough because they are not trying to put a single bullet through his head. They are trying to put high explosive on a 50 square. And a 50 square is something an American company mortar section can do in under a minute. The German doctrine is built around the assumption that the enemy will try to locate the sniper before responding. The American doctrine, which is not really a counter-sniper doctrine at all, but a general fire support doctrine, accidentally applied to sniper hunting, skips that step entirely. It asks a different question. Not where is the sniper, but what area can he plausibly be in? And then it puts steel on that area until the question is moot. This same pattern showed up in the Pacific. A Marine forward observer for mortars on Okinawa, in an account preserved in Guns Magazine's History of Pacific Snipers, reported that a friendly sniper team joined him on a ridge. Every time the sniper team fired a shot, they had to run because the Japanese would quickly drop a mortar pattern on the spot they had just vacated. The mechanism is the same. The Japanese had figured out the area suppression answer to the sniper problem too, at least in some units. The Americans had built it into doctrine and wired it across an entire army. For the German on the Western Front, this had a specific and terrifying practical consequence. The doctrine he had learned, with its insistence on movement after firing, did not actually save him. It just changed the shape of his death. If he stayed in place, he died from the first mortar barrage that landed on his hedgerow. If he moved, he died from the second mortar barrage the Americans walked across the suspected escape route. By the time he had figured out which mistake had killed him, he was usually beyond the point of figuring anything out. But for area suppression of this kind of work, something else had to be in place, something the Americans had that no other army in the war had built, something the Germans could not understand because the cultural and organizational pieces simply did not exist in their own army. In the late summer of 1944, officers at the German Army High Command sat down to read documents that should have changed German tactics on the Western Front. They were translations prepared by German military intelligence from captured American field manuals describing the fire direction center system. The procedures were laid out in detail, the coordinate grids, the firing table conventions, the role of the forward observer, the radio protocols, everything. The officers reading the documents had difficulty believing what they were seeing. The conclusion German evaluators kept reaching was that such a centralized system could not actually be functioning the way the captured manuals described. Field manuals describe ideal procedures, they reasoned. Real combat is chaotic. No army could be running this kind of centralized procedure in practice. The Americans must be doing something else, something the documents disguised. They were not. The documents were accurate. The Americans were really doing what their manuals said they were doing. And the reason German intelligence could not believe it is the deepest layer of the story. The German army had been built organizationally on a doctrine that Germans themselves named Auftragstaktik, mission tactics. The senior officer issued a mission objective. The junior officer figured out how to achieve it. The system favored initiative, flexibility, the rapid exploitation of local opportunity. It was the doctrine that had produced the lightning campaigns of 1939 and 1940 and the staggering Soviet defeats of 1941. In many respects, it was an excellent doctrine, and it had one weakness that became fatal in the bocage and on the road to the Rhine. Off-Trag's tactic was a doctrine of decentralized command. It worked by giving every commander, down to the platoon level, broad authority to use whatever assets he had. But if the firepower available to a platoon commander was limited to what his own platoon carried, then the firepower at the platoon's disposal would be exactly that. His machine guns, his mortars, the rifles of his men. If he wanted artillery, he had to call up the chain of command and wait. There was no equivalent of the American forward observer carrying a radio that gave him direct access to multiple battalions' worth of fire support. The German system did not produce such a man because the German system was not built that way. Each level of command was supposed to handle its own problems with its own assets. The American system was, in this one specific respect, exactly the opposite. The American doctrine of fire support said that any infantry commander, no matter how junior, should have, through his attached forward observer, access to every gun in range. Not just the guns of his own battalion, not just the guns of his own division. Every gun in range, including Corps and Army-level artillery, was reachable through the FDC network. The priorities for which units' fires would respond to which calls were sorted out by the FDC in real time, sometimes in seconds. This was not a system the Germans could copy in 1944. They did not have the radio infrastructure. They did not have the firing tables that allowed any battery to engage any target on minutes' notice. They did not have the training pipeline to produce thousands of forward observers who shared a common doctrine and a common map grid. Above all, they did not have the cultural willingness to centralize fire control to that degree. Centralized fire direction was, from an Off-Trag's tactic perspective, exactly the wrong way to organize combat. It removed initiative from the local commander. It turned the front line into a bureaucratic process. In Normandy and beyond, the German army discovered that this bureaucratic process was faster than initiative could ever be. The German sniper, working alone in his hedgerow, was the smallest possible expression of Off-Trag's tactic. One man, one rifle, one mission. He embodied the German doctrine of decentralized lethality, and he was being killed by the most centralized fire control system any army had ever built. The two doctrines met in the Norman fields, and the one lost. The Germans were not failing because the Americans were braver, or because they were better marksmen, or because they had any particular technological miracle. The Americans were winning because they had built over the course of 15 years, and on minimal budget, an organizational system that integrated every gun in the theater with every forward observer through a common procedure. Brewer's work at Fort Sill in the 1930s had given them this. The hedgerow in 1944 was where it paid off. If your father, grandfather, or uncle served in any of the American divisions that fought through the Bocage country, the Hurtgen, or the Bulge, I would be honored to read their story. What unit did they serve in? Did they ever talk about the snipers, about the mortar crews, about the forward observers walking with them with a radio on their back and a coordinate book in their pocket? The accounts that never made it into the history books are often the ones that matter most. Return to the hedgerow. The German sniper has fired one shot. The American radio man is dead. The sniper is folding his canvas, preparing to move. In his head, the doctrine he was taught is ticking. He has perhaps 2 minutes before any meaningful return fire arrives. He has been told that this is enough time. He has been told that it is more than enough time. What he does not know is that 200 miles behind the dead radio man, an American sergeant has already picked up a sound-powered telephone. The sergeant did not see the sniper. He did not need to. He saw the radio man fall. He heard the report of the rifle from the bocage to his front, and he knew the bearing. He did not stop to investigate. He did not order his men forward to flush out the position. He picked up the telephone, called his company's 60mm mortar section, and gave them a 6-digit grid reference and a single word, sniper. The mortar crew, sitting in a shallow pit 50 meters behind the company command post, has been waiting for this call all morning. They have been registering targets along the company's front since the night before. Their tube is already laid on a pre-planned target reference point that covers the relevant stretch of bocage. They do not need to recalculate the firing solution from scratch. They are already aimed within 50 meters of where they need to be. They adjust. They drop the round. The first shell is in flight before the German sniper has crawled 10 meters from his firing position. From here, the mathematics is simple. The mortar fires 4 rounds in roughly 8 seconds. The fragments from each round travel outward in a lethal radius of about 17 yd. The 4 impact points cover a rectangle approximately 50 meters long and 15 meters wide. The sniper, in the few seconds since the first round detonated, has crawled perhaps another 5 men. He is still inside the rectangle. He was never going to get out of the rectangle. There is no second shot from the sniper. There never will be. In the months that followed, German sniper training schools tried to adjust. They began teaching their students to move much faster after firing, to accept lower hit rates in exchange for more aggressive exfiltration, to fire from positions farther from the hedgerow edges, deeper in cover, where the box of mortar fire would be harder to plot. None of these adjustments fundamentally solved the problem, because the problem was not solvable from the sniper's side. The problem was the American fire control system, and the German army could not match it because matching it would have required rebuilding their entire doctrine of command and control. The Auftragstaktik tradition that had made them so dangerous in 1940 had become, by 1944, the architectural reason they could not respond. So they kept dying through Normandy, through the breakout at Saint-Lô, through the closing of the Falaise pocket, through the long fighting retreat across France, through Aachen and the Hurtgen and the Bulge and the Rhine. The German snipers kept doing what they had been taught to do, and the Americans kept doing what they had been taught to do, and the casualty tables kept running in one direction. When American intelligence officers interviewed surviving members of the German sniper schools after the war, they encountered a particular kind of observation again and again. The American counter-sniper response had been inexplicable. It came too fast, from too many directions, with a kind of impersonal accuracy that did not match anything the survivors had been taught to expect. The men receiving it had not been able to identify what they were facing, because what they were facing was not really a counter-sniper system. It was a fire support architecture. The counter-sniper effect was a side product of an architecture designed to do something much larger. The final verdict is this: the Germans were not puzzled by some hidden American technology. There was no secret weapon. There was no special sensor. What killed the German sniper was not a thing. It was a procedure. It was the procedure of the American Fire Direction Center, scaled down from artillery to the company mortar, distributed across every rifle squad in Europe by way of the radio and the field telephone. The Germans could not understand it because they were looking for the wrong kind of answer. They were looking for a piece of equipment they could capture, dissect, and copy. There was no such piece of equipment. The American advantage was organizational. It was the willingness to entrust every frontline sergeant with the power to call down fire from a system he did not personally control. It was the cultural decision made by obscure officers at the Field Artillery School in Oklahoma during the Depression years that the front line should be wired to the rear and that the rear should answer in seconds. The German sniper of 1944 was the finest small arms specialist any army has ever produced. He was the product of a quarter century of careful institutional learning. His weapon was excellent. His training was excellent. His doctrine was in any war the Germans had fought before sound. He was beaten by something so unglamorous that no post-war history gave it a famous name. He was beaten by a clipboard, a map grid, a sound-powered telephone, and a mortar crew who knew what to do with a 6-digit number. The men who built that system were not the men who became famous. The artillery officers of Brewer's generation at Fort Sill, the forward observers of the bocage with their 38-pound radios and their coordinate books, the mortar crews in their shallow pits who could put 4 rounds in a 50-meter rectangle in under a minute, working from a phoned-in grid reference in a one-word target description. They did not have heroic biographies. They did not have famous portraits. They did not even have a distinctive uniform. They were just men with radios and maps and the discipline to follow a procedure under fire. But they were the men, more than any single rifleman or sniper or tanker, who made the German sniper's doctrine obsolete in the West. They were the reason the captured German sniper logbooks from France grew thinner as the campaign progressed. They were the reason the question, "How did the Americans locate me before my second shot?" was the wrong question. The Americans never located him. They suppressed an area he was inside. The distinction was the difference between his life and his death. If this story changed the way you look at the hidden systems of history, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. We are uncovering the tactical truths that were nearly buried by time. Help us plant the seeds for future historical discoveries. The next treasure of the past will be revealed soon.